Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Telciu Summer Conferences, our 9th edition. We are starting today with the second panel on trans-peripheral dialogues and alliances. We will be hearing presentations by Ioana Pantilimon from SNSPA Bucharest, from Oana Sânziana Marian from the Loyola Institute at the Trinity College Dublin and Raluca Grosescu, University of Bucharest. Before we start, I want to ask everyone who is watching us on YouTube to please share their comments and questions should they have any. It's useful for us if you can write your whole name so that we know who we're talking to. We will be continuing the discussion on decolonizing revolutions, social movements, commoning, and spiritualities. And so today we want to hear about how we can do this from the peripheries and how do we create our alliances. We will start now. Every presenter has 20 minutes. You will probably see the PowerPoint presentations. And as I was saying, you are welcome to share your comments and participate in the discussion by writing there your comments and questions in the respective section on YouTube. So, Ioana, when you're ready, you have the floor.
Okay. Can you hear me? It's
Yes.
fine. Okay, fine. So I'm going to start now. Just a second. Okay. So hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Ioana Pantilimon. I am currently a PhD student in SNSPA Bucharest, and today my presentation will be focused on epistemic extractivism, the way knowledge is being produced, and practices of epistemic decolonization. And I would like to begin with a personal anecdote that in a way introduces the focus of the paper. And it's not that personal, it's personal if as an experience, if we consider literature as an experience. So a few years ago, I was reading a book by a Romanian author, which was actually his travel diary, talking about his experience in the journey in the Peruvian Andes. And following the steps of Hiram Bingham, who is internationally praised to be the discoverer of Machu Picchu, the author hires a local guide to first carry his bags, and then he expects him to provide a local authentic story. The guide, as we find from the book, proves disobedient in a way that he doesn't do the things the author expects him to. And in the same time, he doesn't speak Spanish, and he speaks Quechua, and he is not able to provide him with that authentic story he was looking for. And in front of his disobedience and lack of language to tell that story, the author becomes frustrated and angry. Anecdotally or not, the name of the local guide was Lucho, which from Spanish roughly translates as 5. And how I stated in the beginning of my presentation, this somehow introduces the focus of my paper. On one hand, because it's telling in regard to the larger discussion on knowledge production and authorship, and on the relation of power between the subject and object of research. It's telling also because travel and explorer diaries were for a long time instruments for extracting knowledge. And in the same time, the instruments have diversified in time. Nevertheless, talking about epistemic extractivism is talking about decolonizing practices, about these peripheral spaces, these islands that are not inhabited by passive subjects. And talking about epistemic extractivism is talking about cognitive justice. My presentation is not a finished product, is not a refined product, but is rather a process. And it will be talking first and foremost the general idea of extractivism. Then it will tackle a bit the circuits of knowledge production between North and South, the epistemic extractivism, and at the end will offer some practices, will show some practices of epistemic decolonization. So with no further introduction, I will go directly to extractivism, which generally describes a process of large-scale extraction of natural resources that are exported to the core and end up on the global market as finished product. It is a destructive way of appropriating nature through, and not limited to, agriculture, farming, fishing, logging, water dams. And in the same time, beyond describing this objective fact of resources being extracted, Maristela Svampa tells us that when talking about extractivism, we talk about an analytical category with a great mobilizing power, meaning that extractivism does not describe the facts, but describes this, it directly denunciates this as a predatory practice, as the model of accumulation through dispossession of land, to the destruction of the environment, of life, of livelihoods in general. And in front of these injustices, peoples and communities mobilize to reclaim their right to water, to land, and to life in general. And from these struggles and mobilization, different alternatives arise. One of these alternatives is Sumakasai or Sumakamania, which literally translates as buen vivir or good living. This alternative came to be described as opposing to the destruction and the destructive extractivism in general. A short search in Google on buen vivir will retrieve almost 1 million results. There are almost 1 million articles dealing with what is buen vivir, on how it can be implemented, and how it led to constitutional changes in Bolivia and Ecuador, and how it opened up a global debate on the rights of nature. And this example of buen vivir is telling in the larger discussion on how knowledge is produced and circulates between North and South. So in this circuits of knowledge between North and South, there are many authors who talk about academic dependency, about an existing international division of labor in which the global North is the producer of universal theories, while the global South is merely the consumer and provider of case studies. This reality is sustained by certain institutional arrangements, including citation practices, international rankings, exploitation, favoring the dominion of only a few celebrity intellectuals, and start from the premise that only the knowledge produced in the South is localized. In the colonial encounters, Mignolo and Quijano point out that there is an ongoing colonial access to knowledge that occludes other ways of knowing. In this circuit of knowledge, however, epistemic extractivism exists also. And as a concept, as an idea, it was very recently introduced formally by Ramon Grosescu. And in a way, it has the same denunciatory and mobilizing power that Svampa discusses in relation to resource extractivism. To talk about it is enabling for the articulation and examination of the exploitative practices in the circuits of knowledge production. It exists in a system where knowledge is being commodified and in which there is a value that is always attached a priori to a way of knowing that makes the difference between what is common sense, what is universal, and what can be appropriated into the common knowledge. What it tells a lot about what the imaginary is about what knowledge is and what is authorized knowledge and what knowledge has no author and has value and can be appropriated. Smith, for example, states that knowledge extraction from the indigenous communities, and she talks about the case of Maori people in New Zealand, includes but is not limited to the exploitation and mining of belief systems, the appropriation of ways of organizing, the appropriation of ideas about relationships. And in discussing the decolonization of methodologies, she says that it's important to understand the complex ways in which the pursuit of knowledge is deeply embedded in the multiple layers of imperial and colonial practices. In relation, coming back to this idea of epistemic extractivism as such, this idea was introduced by Ramon Grosescu in 2016, who brought together two contributions, one of Lian Betasamosake-Simpson and the other of Silvia Rivera Cusicancui. His aim when talking about epistemic extractivism was not to define the idea, to define the concept, but merely to introduce it in the larger discussion of the epistemologies of the South project and to bring it to into the larger discussion about cognitive justice. For Simpson, cognitive or intellectual extractivism is always related to resource extraction, in the sense that the imaginary of the colonizer works only towards exploiting and appropriating without honest and equal dialogue, without respect, without reciprocity, and without responsibility. Her contribution was made in an interview, came to light actually, in an interview that was taken by Naomi Klein, and it was taken in the context of the Idle No More movement, which is a permanent protest movement against the Canadian state settled colonialist policy-making practices, basically. And it started in 2013 when the government was pushing for less and less environmental assessments and for more and more extractive projects. The second contribution that Ramon Grosescu wrote was the one of Silvia Rivera Cusicancui, who criticizes the monumentalization of knowledge and its commodification within the modernity coloniality scholarship. Her critique addresses the ways in which Walter Mignolo and Anibal Quijano continuously extracted knowledge and established hierarchies and adopted new gurus through the world of references, citations, and they extracted knowledge from the communities without engaging with them. And it's important also to note that for Silvia Rivera Cusicancui, we cannot speak about decoloniality and coloniality. We can speak about colonization, and because it did not end it, and decolonization as a result. And she nominalizes scholars in her critique, but in the same time, she states that what happened with this extraction is that it contributed to social capital, to prestige, and to the consolidation of the academic career of people who were actually disengaged from the community. In short, epistemic extractivism in this way existed as we see coexisted and coexist with resource extractivism and follows the same logic. It operates in this consensus that Spamba was talking about in relation to resource extractivism. Under this generalized idea, the things are just like that. We either live with that or that's it. We cannot do anything about it, basically. Nevertheless, in the struggles against epistemic extractivism and for epistemic justice, there are also decolonizing practices. And as you can see, I listed some of the ideas on the slide. And their contribution, in my view, is fundamental for pluriversity and pluriversality, because they represent a radical change in epistemology. And they contribute to a community of knowledge where many communities fit. Scholars, as we can see, called for decolonizing methodologies, for developing new methodologies, for radical reciprocity or use of bilingualism, for example, in front of the injustices of the imperial mode of thinking. And recently, beyond the contributions of Smith, Simpson, and Rivera Cusicancui, there is the contribution of G. Sosa Santos, who calls for an ecology of knowledges, where intercultural and interpolitical translations are possible. And his idea generally is that we need to make different ways of struggling, different struggles, communicate and develop a sense of solidarity. And in his aim of bringing together different epistemologies, he calls for demonumentalizing universalism. And more recently, another contribution is the one of Walter Mignolo, who states that, as in the case of decoloniality, decolonialism needs this interchange of experiences and meanings in a world where, if we do otherwise, only the establishment will gain. So, to conclude a bit, this discussion of epistemic extractivism is political, and this speaks about how knowledge is appropriated and reappropriated, sanitized, and closed in bookshelves. Knowledge is political, and through extractivism and through talking about epistemic extractivism, through talking about decolonizing knowledge, is being more politicized. So this, in a way, is a call for radically changing the way we produce knowledge, the way we monumentalize it, and it does that by first and foremost getting rid of the singular and the singularity. And I think that my presentation will end here. I was in a hurry, being afraid that I don't know if, I think it's fine with the time. So
it's perfect. Thank you very much, Ioana. It was a very informative presentation, and I'm sure it will give us a lot of food for thought and for debate during our discussion. If Oana is ready now, we can go on to listening to her presentation.
Okay, so I'm going to share, because my research and my practice is so much about acknowledging embodied reality. I just want you to hear the poet that I'm going to talk about. So if you can't hear him, just give me a sign.
Unfortunately, we can't hear the sound.
Okay, so that's fine. That means I can just read it myself, and recommend that you look for it. If I take my, is that any better?
Yes, a bit low though, low volume.
In the census, the 1911 census, as a 6-year-old girl. So Hannah, I spent a lot of my childhood with Hannah. She had me dragged about the city on my knees. She was very devout. She had a great devotion to Our Lady, but she absolutely despised the clergy. Hannah, grandmother, coldest day yet of November, her voice close in my ear. Tell them priests nothing. Was I 12? Was I 13? Filthy minded. Keep your sins to yourself. Don't be giving them a thrill, dirty old feckers. As close as she came to the birds and the bees on her knees in front of the Madonna, Our Lady of the Facts of Life, beside the confessional, oak door closing like a coffin lid, neatly carpentered, waxed and buffed. In the well-made box of this poem, her voice dies. She closes her eyes and lowers her brow to her joined hands, prays hard, woman to woman.
So before I forget, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Oana, and I am based in Dublin at the moment. And I am writing a dissertation on poetry and theology and constructions of otherness in the Christian imagination, but I'm looking at 3 Irish poets. And I also wanted to share when, I hope you could hear when Paula Meehan was describing the part of Dublin that her grandmother was born. She referred to the Monto area. And so the Monto is a part of Dublin that now is north inner city Dublin. And it's a part of Dublin that was once the biggest red light district in Europe. So this shows up also in Ulysses, in Joyce's Ulysses, where British generals and early Irish Republicans alike were often found feasting at the same table, so to speak. So she says about the Monto, its economic base was destroyed, and of course that's the economic base of the brothels, was destroyed with the pullout, pun intended, of the British Army after the War of Independence. I want to say thank you for the organizers, fellow presenters, and for all the relationships and conversations that led us here by way of dialogue, conversations we are having in our citation practices as well. Thank you for food that nourishes me today, all that shelters me, resources that make life possible. For example, a small but saving unemployment payment from the Republic of Ireland, where I currently live. Thank you to my ancestors who survived. The conversation that I propose comes from a curious observation, which I will share, then provide some theoretical and theological background, situating Paula Meehan within it. before doing, if there's time, a close reading with you of one of her poems. So this will be more self-consciously performative presentation that includes an invocation, an observation, an orientation, and then an exercise of attention. The observation is this: within activist and academic spaces, even eco-feminist ones, when an Indigenous person is present, she, and it is most often someone who identifies as a woman, invariably begins with ritual practices of thanksgiving, dedication, land acknowledgement, and calling on ancestral support, as Xinca Maya Guatemalan activist Lorena Cabnal did when she visited Dublin last year, beginning her presentation by laying out a medicine wheel with the Xinca and Maya colors, flowers, and various objects, quote, to connect to the land of her home while on distant soil. These practices take time. Some might complain precious time away from issues to be engaged. Another argument is that they make time in the sense that they focus how we engage, as well as what we engage. Within Judeo-Christian theological language, this is a move away from chronos, which is to say clock time, linear time, the time in which progress happens, toward kairos, the time of the now, according to Giorgio Agamben's commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans, and the time that remains. This is a messianic and apocalyptic time in both sense of revelation and unfolding disaster when we say apocalypse. In a more practical sense, these rituals acknowledge that our time is relational, while also initiating a spatial reorientation from Newtonian individual bodies to bodies of possible encounter, bodies in relation to the land, to resources, to other bodies. For example, yesterday, Manuela's acknowledgements, both temporal and spatial loss, and also of holding, through the mention of Telciu meantime and images of the space where we would be if we could be together, serve as perfect example of a conscious reorientation toward kairos. And it is a decolonization, decolonial practice. I make time to connect to the land of my home while on distant soil. Born in Romania, educated in the US, now a permanent resident of Ireland, I am preoccupied, like many of you, with questions of home, soil, and indigeneity, points of connection to a post-national belonging. There are equally points of contention around indigeneity, questions of blood and soil around the inhumane treatment of asylum seekers and the direct provision system in Ireland. Many are aware of recent referenda on marriage equality and reproductive rights here, less aware of a referendum in 2004 around birthright citizenship. These referenda represent different orientations around bodies and propriety. Again, the curious part of my observation is that while activists and academics not identified as Indigenous accept, expect, even admire these ritual practices, they do not generally perform them themselves. And it is very easy to see why this is so. In Ireland, Christian and Celtic forms of spirituality are out of the question. First, because of legacies of Catholic Protestant sectarian conflict, clerical abuses, and the forced servitude by various Catholic orders of poor and unwed mothers into Magdalene laundries. So here, and I share here photos that I took of an anonymous artistic intervention on the walls of the last Magdalene laundry to close around the same time as the Good Friday Agreement. And these were spaces where poor and unwed women were enclosed, often for life, and laundering the garments of the clergy. So this area is very close to the area where Meehan would have grown up, also known formally as the Monto. And just so you can have a better view of exactly what's on the walls, this is the Sheila Nagig, ancient Celtic symbols. So we'll stay here. The independence and nation building agendas of the Celtic revival period in the earlier part of the 20th century make Celtic deities somewhat dubious invocations as well. Who would begin a functionary meeting now with a Catholic prayer or an invocation of a Celtic deity, not simply as a formality, but as a genuine gesture of orienting humans within the context of the sacred and the rest of creation? This last part, of course, is needed. I am not advocating for the appropriation of specific Indigenous practices, but proposing an orientation which has a quality of indigeneity towards conscious performances of intersubjectivity. So my social and theoretic location. I am a poet studying theology because I'm interested in, and I'm quoting British practical theologian Heather Walton, how the sacred speaks and is speakable within cultural forms. This preoccupation falls under the purview of theopoetics, an intersection of liberation theology, practical theology, creative arts, and activist practices, of which Walton is one contemporary voice. I'm interested in Paula Meehan's work for thematic and formal reasons. I will talk about themes first, and then forms if there is time for a close reading. Thematic because while many Irish poets have written out of the mythic past, as well as the 30 years of the Troubles, and here you see it's quite problematic to say, even to say Irish poet. Do I mean the island or the Republic or the North? Seamus Heaney is probably the best known Irish poet, always called an Irish poet, but he was from the North. Meehan is one of the few established poets who takes on the horrors of neoliberalism in Ireland and connects them all the way down to centuries of colonial trauma, the heroin and homeless epidemics amid the boom and bust of the Celtic Tiger period within the same inner city where the Monto had been. And she takes a full account of the loss and silencing of communities in poems and interviews and other forms of public speech. And here I find particularly poignant the part where she says, when a disenfranchised community is hit by a level of addiction, then it is a public health crisis. And the children who are the potential class activists and community leaders are zonked out of their heads and dying like flies, then it is a political issue rather than one of personal choice. And perhaps ironically, one of the most visible public monuments in Dublin is a monument in the north inner city part in formerly the Monto, and it looks like a giant needle. So there's violence in the landscape as well. And of course, Meehan connects colonial traumas to the climate crisis as well as, again, as a public voice, often taking on public commissions, such as one with National Gallery last year, reaching into public space. And in an interview here, she was responding, she had a poem that was responding to an exhibit, artists representing Irish landscape. And this, she was particularly drawn to these salt bowls that are mined from County Tyrone. Meehan's Poetic does something akin to Christina Sharp's theorization about living in the wake of transatlantic slavery. There is no post here. This is not, of course, to equate the structures of anti-Black racism and with contemporary Irish post-coloniality, but to remind us of connections between body and land events. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz reminds us that the same shock troops that colonized Ireland would eventually also colonize what is now known as the US. How does one acknowledge trauma and come through to the other side, which is life? So again, I'm very appreciative of the previous presentation and conversations that have existed so far about the abandoning of mastery. And I began to think about whether epistemic extractivism also can exist in the poetic. because one of the things that I tend to include in my practice is how to read poetry in a non-extractive way, which of course is really difficult when you're doing a PhD where you're always looking to pull things. So my exercise of attention, if I have time, I think I do. Okay. So far I've not acknowledged that the images that I've used have been collaborations with artists in Ireland. And I think that this is only to just to acknowledge that there is a collaboration that's happening between the different arts. And thinking back to the idea of how to make the sacred, how to make sacred speech or to show that the sacred is speakable. So I will read this and then I will offer some of my close reading observations and then invite eventually in the conversation if anybody else wants to respond to the poem. But I'm thinking about how there's a quote by Bayo Akamalafe, the environmentalist and teacher, saying, "The times are urgent, so let us slow down." And I offer poetry as an unsentimental decolonial practice for slowing down. Our Lady of the Apocalypse. This was part of a sequence of sonnets that was commissioned by a new tenement museum called 14 Henrietta Street in Dublin. And of course, a tenement museum commemorizing an age of poverty in the midst of an epic housing crisis in Dublin did not go unaddressed. So there are 10 sonnets, and I will read this one and mention a few things after. Our Lady of the Apocalypse, who never closed your heart to the dissolute, pray for us, who gave shelter in broken down Georgian tenements, who kept the doors open to the demented ones, those who came in rags and miasmas of foul odor, in delirium tremens, the worn out old spunkers, the displaced relicts of imperial trauma. O sweet daughter of memory, veiled in enigma, who brought longed for oblivion to the meth drinkers, the dipsos, the alcos, the put down no hopers, those who came in from chaos, from cold, from winds, from rain, to sleep it all off in hallways and stairwells, who rent the long night with sobs, who cried out to you in the throes of their last agony. Grant them eternal succor. To Polyhymnia, muse of sacred poetry. So as an exercise, I've been sending, as part of my practice as well, I've been sending poems to people I know are susceptible to poetry. And we've been exchanging voice messages on WhatsApp in response to particular poems. And I'm using this as an archive of embodied response to poetry, which after all is a form of matter. So I find the line ending in the beginning immediately interesting. So to begin a sort of hagiography with a negation, which is in fact an affirmation couched in another complication. So Our Lady of the Apocalypse, who never closed your heart. So to never close your heart is to remain open. But what does it mean for the Lady of the Apocalypse to remain open to the dissolute? That portends both care and destruction. So the form, of course, of as a simulation of a prayer, but also Meehan uses the sonnet form, reminding us in different interviews that the sonnet was the first appearance of the sonnet in the Irish language came from Raleigh and Spencer, who were, of course, part of the brutal colonization of Ireland. So the appearance of the sonnet form from Italian into English comes packed with all of the baggage of colonial trauma. So she uses it as a way, both as a house and as a form, So house in the sense of stanzas, the word stanza means room. So she uses the rooms of the house. So what does it mean to open your heart to the dissolute for the Lady of the Apocalypse? And then because she has a great attention to dereliction, and we've talked about attention to the periphery. So the periphery here in the first stanza, the demented ones, the periphery of humanity, the people that her grandmother would have known, that she would have grown up with as a child growing up in that part of Dublin. To care for the people who come in as a form of survival. This is what's happening in the first stanza. But then our sweet daughter of memory, veiled in enigma, who brought longed for oblivion. So to bring longed for oblivion is to relieve them of life. So the mercy of both a form of survival, which exists in the first stanza, and the mercy of death in the second stanza. The entire poem, the entire subject of the sonnet is human dereliction, but she does it with compassion and with the care of this form of attention. So what is the kind of recognition that is taking place here? That's one of the questions that I've had. Another important aspect is the Georgian tenement. So the poorest section of Dublin once was the height of imperial architecture. So these changes in the architecture. And I think I will leave it open at that point. But I wanted to invoke a kind of experience because this is such a big part of my research, and I can tell you where this is going, and that I'll be addressing 2 other poets in a similar way. So thank you for the opportunity to share part of this work in progress.
Thank you very much, Oana, for a very insightful, and I also want to say emotional presentation, because I think it touched us beyond merely the epistemic level that we want to have here for the conference. I feel it's very enriching to have come together in this encounter actually different approaches to decolonial practices stemming from different disciplines, dimensions, but also personal experiences. So for me, that is very, very important. And I think it's one of our goals when we organize this kind of events. And we will now move on to Raluca Grosescu's presentation, if you're ready. Titled Transnational Advocacy Networks and Corporate Accountability for International Crimes. If all is good, Raluca, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope well, people will still follow this presentation after the previous very emotional and poetical one. So in my presentation, I explored the transnational mobilizations for holding corporations and their representatives accountable for major international crimes such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So this kind of complicity emerged in a variety of historical context, particularly dictatorship and war zones, such as, for example, just one moment. I don't know how to, okay. So, for example, the cooperation of Chiquita brands with Colombian paramilitaries in order to expropriate farmers and advance their plantation in the territories of these farmers, the use of slave labor by giant oil Total in Myanmar, or the complicity of Shell in the repression of Ogoni activists in Nigeria. So corporate accountability is now a cause in the making, where various NGOs, trade unions, victims association mobilize across borders in order to create binding norm upon corporation and sanction them for this kind of complicity in gross human rights violation. And in contrast to the previous literature that has looked at this mobilization as a rather unified cause, which is driven by idealistic activists bound together by shared values, intense cooperation, and common visions about corporate accountability, I want to emphasize the diversity of visions and projects, as well as the diversity of organization involved with their different approaches to human rights, development, and economic globalization. And all this mobilization involved actually cooperation between NGOs and other organizations from the Global South and the Global North. And it's also an interesting topic in order to analyze the relationship of cooperation, competition, and domination between these organizations. And the presentation is part of a bigger project that I just started, so I hope it's not too fragmented. In 2016, I conducted research on this topic in Colombia, and in Bogota, I was in contact with the two main NGOs that are actually involved in transitional justice, dealing with post-conflict justice, and with the role of economic actors in the Colombian conflict, which lasted between 1963 and 2016. The first NGO that I investigated, it's named De Justicia, and it's a research and activist organization, which is founded by social scientists, most of them specialized in constitutional law and having PhD in North America and Europe. So their main purpose is actually to consolidate constitutionalism, rule of law, and peace building in Colombia. And during one of the interviews that I had with the Justicia members, one of them told me, we agree that peace cannot be built without social justice, but we dissociate ourselves from the neo-Marxist agendas of other NGOs, which use transitional justice to fight global capitalism. So De Justicia is dealing with corporate accountability for international crime, but also considers that foreign investment and the presence of multinational corporations in Colombia are key elements for stability in this country. From this point of view, they do not have a confrontational approach towards corporate violence, and they establish partnership with university, particularly in the UK, in order to construct strategies to convince corporations to donate money in reparation funds, and also to establish a model of truth commission that will acknowledge the involvement of economic actors in the conflict, but consider that actually prison can be problematic, could divide the society, and might have an negative economic effect on on private investment and economic stability. So this is the kind of research that they are producing. So here, for instance, there is a let's say a report about how Truth Commission functioned across the world and how Colombia could be informed by these experiences. And they also published very influential academic work published by the most important publishing houses in the world, such as Cambridge, Oxford, etc. When I entered the headquarters of the second NGO in Bogota, CAJAR, it's a group of lawyers that was created in 1980 in order to defend leftist militants who were persecuted by the authorities, including former disarmed guerrilleros. And when I entered the headquarters of this NGO, I was struck by a big picture of Marx and Engels dominating one of the main offices. So these were the NGOs that had a neo-Marxist agenda, as I was told before by De Justicia. So CAJAR promotes a maximalist and confrontational approach to post-conflict justice, and they specifically focus on prosecutions of high-rank militaries and economic actors, which actually had been left aside by the official policy of transitional justice in Colombia, which prioritizes prosecutions of paramilitaries and former guerrilleros. And they also they want to deal with the role of multinational corporations in the Colombian conflict, not only with local economic actors. And one of their main partner at a national level, it's a trade union, Sinal-Trinal. It's the biggest trade union from food and agricultural industry, and this trade union gathers actually many workers from Coca-Cola and Nestlé. The purpose of Sinal-Trinal is transnational cooperation in order to fight global neoliberalism and the inequalities of global capitalism and their implication in Colombia, but also its history is embedded in a very violent context against trade unionists in Colombia during the conflict. So, for example, between 1986 and 2013, 26 leaders of Sinal-Trinals were killed or disappeared days before important negotiation with Nestlé and Coca-Cola. And at an international level, CAHAR collaborates with various NGOs, but one of the most important partners, it's a German NGO based in Berlin, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. And it's an NGO formed by radical lawyers. And the purpose actually is to lead strategic litigations that could change international law. So not only use law for victims, but use this strategic litigation in order to change international law in terms of corporate accountability and in terms of disciplining and regulating the abuses of Western companies in the global South. These three organizations, they in 2012, they actually brought together a criminal complaint in Switzerland. This criminal complaint was brought against representatives of Nestlé, but also against Nestlé, the company itself, because Switzerland is one of the very few jurisdictions in the world that actually allows criminal responsibility for the company itself for crimes, crimes or negligence concerning its employees abroad. So the European Center for Constitutional Rights actually chose this case in order to test Switzerland as a potential venue to criminalize, to criminalize companies. And for Sinal-Trinal, for the trade union, it was actually a way, according to their declaration, a way to bring their cause and to the global north, and actually to pressure Nestlé for a more favorable way of negotiating with trade unions in Colombia. So, however, in 2014, the case was closed down because the prosecutors in Switzerland considered that the statutory of limitation for the crimes had passed. There was a complaint at the European Court of Human Rights, but because the people who complained were not Europeans, the complaint was dismissed. And now this organization lodged a criminal complaint at the International Criminal Court, alleging that violence against trade unionists amounted to crimes against humanity, so that ICC should investigate. But I think it's very improbable that something like this would happen. Also, CAHAR and Sinal-Trinal brought a civil complaint against Coca-Cola in the United States, alleging actually of collaboration between Coca-Cola and paramilitaries in order to silence trade unionists just before negotiation. But again, this complaint was unsuccessful. The judges in the United States said that there was no proof that actually this violence against trade unionists was part of the internal conflict, and because it was not part of the internal conflict, this could not be considered to be war crimes or crimes against humanity. And actually, the law under which this complaint was brought required that the crimes would be committed within the framework of major international crime. So this complaint against Coca-Cola was also unsuccessful, but both this complaint actually had a very important media impact, and also sort of effect of naming and shaming against the corporation, this corporation had to defend themselves in courts, and they also had to publicly respond well to this accusation. And moreover, Sinal Trainal, it's also part, together with Guatemalan trade unions, of the boycott Stop Killer Coke, which was initiated in the United States by labor activist Ray Rogers. This campaign that I intend to study in my project also so far led to 15 American universities to prohibit the selling of Coca-Cola products on the campuses. And also Ray Rogers was invited well, in various negotiations to Coca-Cola, but in the end, I mean, the boycott is still ongoing. Okay, I want to present you now a third case, and then I will try to conclude a bit about the different visions between corporate accountability, development, human rights, and political views. So this case, so in 2006, the mineral company, Canadian mineral company Hudbay, was given permission to mining exploitation in the Quechí territories in Guatemala. So this, well, this authorization was followed by protest, and the protests were followed by forced eviction and by violence, which was led by state authorities, but also security forces from Hudbay participated. And in 2011, 11 Mayan women brought a complaint to Canada accusing Hudbay personnel of raping them and of killing 2 of their husbands. So when I interviewed these Mayan women in Guatemala, their mobilizations seemed to have a wider agenda than obtaining reparations from Hudbay. So the idea was actually to bring their visions on human rights, development, and gender to the global north. During a judicial hearing in Ontario, these women talked about mining exploitation as part of a neo-colonial liberal project of modernization that opposes indigenous visions about the world, in which humans and nature are inseparable. So actually they went and they talked, for example, about the concept of Tierra Madre and the cosmogony, the Mayan cosmogony. And for them, as far as they told me in the interview, it was important to bring this vision and to make the global north hearing this, let's say, vision, that this indigenous approach that actually wanted to stop Western modern exploitation of lands. So these 3 cases, or let's say 3 networks, which also have, they illustrate in my vision 3 visions about corporate accountability and about economic development and about politics. And these visions are not only present in Latin America, in transnational mobilization between Europe and Latin America, but I also found them in South Africa. So on the one hand, sorry. Okay, so on the one hand, we have a neoliberal framework, although also with a social agenda. So here, corporate accountability has to be implemented, but as a function of foreign investment and economic growth. Also, the main point of the organization which are involved in this kind of mobilization are more the defense of civil and political rights and constitutional rights rather than socio-economic rights. Then we have a neo-Marxist framework, which is a confrontational approach to corporate accountability that wants to advance international law in order to fight global capitalists, but still in Western frameworks of modernization. And then the third one are these indigenous approaches, which also have a strong accountability agenda with the purpose to advance the hegemony of Western liberal modernization and to well, return to their own view on development in which is not based necessarily on economic growth, but human development in harmony with nature. So when we look at this organization, we can okay, we can also elaborate a little bit about the relationship between North and South. So first of all, what I see is that there are transnational political ideas that goes and unites the South and the North. So this is the first one. The second one is that, of course, NGOs from the global North remain somehow dominant because they have more resources, and because also justice venues in the global South are generally blocked. So they also have this opportunity, well, to open cases in the global North. And there are many critical articles that actually say that this organization from the global North are instrumentalizing organizations from the global South in order to get money, in order to, well, to create their own professional positioning in the field. But I think that this is also an emancipatory process, or not emancipatory, it's also a beneficial process for organization in the global South, in the sense that they also, well, get money, they get financed their project, and these litigations that are brought in the global North could be beneficial for criminal and social justice in the global South. So this is something that I want to test further in my research, and I would want to finish with a quotation from a radical South African activist, who actually in an interview, he told me, it's not possible to decolonize global capitalism. It's not possible to decolonize international law. The domination of the global South, the domination of the global North is hard to eradicate, but we can build a radical subaltern mobilization across the globe, which would put into question neoliberal and neo-colonial structures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raluca. Before we dive into the discussion, as we have started rather abruptly, yes, I saw your video. I want to take one as example and start by thanking the person who has made this virtual encounter possible, even though we cannot, for motives outside our wants and desires, we cannot meet in person in Telciu. There is a person who is making our virtual encounter here possible, and this person is our technician, Emil Flora. So I think he should be acknowledged for his amazing job and for being here with us every day, making sure that everything goes well. And I think what we are able to achieve, again, although we are not all physically in the same place in Telciu, is to create this common epistemic site where we exchange knowledge and experience coming from different approaches and disciplines. And I think this is very fitting with the theme of this panel, in the sense that we are creating an alliance of various epistemic sites, but also personal experiences. And I think as I saw in your presentations, we actually bring with us not just our experience as researchers and human beings, but also we carry within us all the sites and that we research and the other people that we came in contact with. And I think this is very transformative. And I think this is a grounding alliance for the decolonial struggle. And just to give you an idea about the locations we're talking from physically at this point, which may or may not be peripheries, we're talking from Dublin, Lunca Mureșului, Bucharest, Chișinău, Freiburg, Barcelona, and Cluj, if I didn't mention it. So these are the places we're talking from now. I don't know, Ovidiu, if we're going to say something else. In that case, I want to thank you again for your presentations. If any of you has any question or comment that they would like to start with. Ovidiu?
Hi, everybody. Well, I would also like to take advantage of this moment to thank to Adina and Tasia for all the work that they've been doing, and especially for their long-term commitment and extraordinary work that has been done not only this year in these circumstances, but also the past years. So this is the place to applaud you. And so thank you for the three presentations. I have a question for each one of you, and I'll try to be very short. So first for Ioana, I don't know, in my mind, when we come to Telciu, like Tasia said, I think we're trying to make this a place where the audience is different in that we try to know whom we are talking to, if not now, maybe later. And so I feel that if we talk about decolonial thought without addressing local decolonial thought, or, it's also, if we make abstraction of talking to people who have been involved for so long with decolonial thought, and we make abstraction of them, it's also a form of invisibility or invisibilization. And secondly, and this leads to my question, the question of epistemic extractivism, I think it needs to be looked upon in its context, and at the least in regards to both sides. So there's a couple of voices that have been very aggressively attacking Walter Mignolo, and then there's so many other voices that have not come through in your presentation that have said that Walter Mignolo has done enormously, first of all, to the decolonial epistemic turn, then to actually bring attention to indigenous thought, indigenous concepts, and political and intellectual projects coming from the global south. So I think, and this basically, this is where my question leads, like, how do you see this balance reflected in your paper? Then for Oana, I wanted simply to ask you, what did this preoccupation with Ireland and Irish poets do to your own positionality, right? As a migrant, as originally Romanian, as you say it. And then for Raluca, thank you for this incredibly useful presentation. I guess I wanted to say that it shows how the difference between the three approaches that you underlined, or the difference between the last two, the neo-Marxist and the indigenous approach, may be that one sees that capitalism and coloniality are inextricably linked, and one doesn't. I mean, the neo-Marxist approach tries to reduce, if you put it this way, coloniality to capitalism, whereas the indigenous approach takes both into consideration. I wonder if that confirms your analysis. All right, that's it for me. Thank you all. I wrote a lot and learned a lot already.
Thank you, Ovidiu. So maybe you would like to start answering these questions. Just unmute yourself. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And obviously, it looks like the paper takes things out of context. Obviously, Walter Mignolo's contribution, in my view, is very relevant. It's obviously very relevant for peripheral and for peripheries in general. But what I wanted to show with my paper, with my presentation, is that we should talk also about epistemic extractivism. Beyond talking about the good things that people do in general. I don't know how to put that, but the idea is Mignolo and every decolonial thinker has a great contribution to desoccidentalizing knowledge, to bringing together people who are peripheralized, people who are semi-peripheralized. In the same time, I see how this diversity, this difference is not reflected in the paper. And that's on one hand, because it's not a finished product and is me reflected in the paper, in the sense that I do not necessarily have this, I know, scholarship experience to reflect more complex, I don't know, relationships. But I think in the same time that it's important to talk about epistemic extractivism, and to talk of epistemic extractivism, especially in the sense that how knowledge is subjected to a system of valuation, and how this tends to exclude different ways of knowing. I hope I answered, although I'm not coherent.
Thank you, Ioana. I think your next question or video was for Oana, right?
Yeah, so I will relate an anecdote from last week. I went for the first time to try to go to a pub in Dublin, and I was not served because my accent confused the bartender, who thought I was American, which I am. And Irish people have been very critical of Americans who've been coming on holiday to Ireland during the pandemic, understandably. So obviously this is a comic and not tragic oppression, being deprived of a couple of pints, but I think it was an interesting, and I would say a visceral reminder of how my positionality is always shifting and always worthy of recalibration within the power dynamics that I enter. I am a queer woman who identifies with the gender I was born with. I have spent most of my life as an immigrant who then went to Romania, and I was definitely American and not Romanian. I know that if I came to Ireland directly from Romania and not via 30 years in the US, I would have a very different positionality. So another encounter like this, there's a wonderful organization led by women of color in Ireland called Migrants and Ethnic Minorities for Reproductive Justice. And I went to a conference, and on the panel was a Romanian woman. And when I stood up to ask a question, I was immediately considered as an American. So this question of, you know, where do I locate my positionality as a white identified migrant woman who spent 30 years and was educated in elite universities in the US with a working class background. So it's obvious, to me, it's quite obvious that the passion and fascination with Irish language poetry, so Irish poets in English, but then also Irish poets who write in Irish and then translate into English. And for example, one of the poets I am also studying, Elaine Nahulinan, learned Romanian in order to be able to translate from Romanian, and also translates from Italian. The fascination is with that kind of shiftiness and the fluidity and but where I'm most interested is where those things become most conscious and most visible. And yeah, I think this, this moment particularly, as there's so much talk of like a new Ireland, which of course is not a new Ireland, has always been taking in other influences from outside of the island. It's an island culture. And so Mihan for me is quite a model of somebody who doesn't think of tradition in a very narrow sense. And she's said in several interviews that what will be interesting is to see what the next generation of poets in Ireland, the generation of the children, the people who have arrived and the children of the people who have arrived, and the poetry that they're going to be writing about their Ireland. And so I'm quite grateful for the associations. And I do sometimes introduce myself as a migrant Romanian woman when I feel that it's necessary to do that.
Okay, thank you, Ovidiu, for this question. Yes, I do agree with you. And actually, this is something that people who work on corporate accountability or human rights from a decolonial perspective, this is something that I actually recently discovered interviewing South African activists who are also scholars. So there is one professor of human rights, Tsepo Madlingosi. He is a South African scholar, but who was appointed now the chief of the main, so do you know his work? Okay. So actually, he clearly states what you said, the difference between, well, critical or Marxist approaches to constitutionalism and to human rights is that actually they saw coloniality in connection with capitalism. And what the colonial approaches want to do, want actually to bring in, well, the voices of indigenous population. But when you talk, so this is when you find this kind of discourses when they are articulated by scholars. But once you talk with a community that mobilize, they do not, and particularly I think that in South America or in Central America, in Guatemala, it's something that they saw Marxist guerrillas or left-wing guerrillas as a sort of their allies. So somehow when you talk with the indigenous population, they are not telling, I mean, their cause is against global capitalism. And they see Marxism as a sort of alliance to their cause. But once you talk with scholars who come from this indigenous group, you find the discourse that you said before.
Thank you, Raluca. I think, Ovidiu, if you're good with the answers you got, maybe we can move on. I'm not sure if Manuela was also going to ask questions.
There are some questions from the audience, so I'm happy to hold out and give them the right to speak.
Thank you. So for Oana, Maria Martelli, who also presented yesterday, would like to thank you for your beautiful presentation. And then she would like to ask you the question, what are your thoughts on the possibility of becoming indigenous to land or otherwise resisting to the condition of being a settler?
Thank you, Maria, for that really needful question. And I guess I would say, especially in the context of my reading of Paula Meehan and just getting to know her work and spending time with her voice, I find somehow personally hopeful that there is an imperfect and completely worthwhile endeavor to become indigenous to land. And I think the imperfectness is really important. And maybe some of the different approaches that I see just in the form of poetics have a lot to do with attention, and especially attention to dereliction, and attention in the sense of not trying to order, but just attending, so literally attending, and as a form of care. So care, not in the sense of fixing an abandoned, so I live across from an abandoned lot that could be sold anytime and built up on, and for all profitable intents and purposes, it has no purpose, but to walk by it and to notice what is happening in that lot, and even to just spend time tending to it is a form of growing closer to the space that I'm in. I think it's important also to say that becoming indigenous to land is always in relation to the people and the animals and just the beings and even the structures that are already there. I'm thinking also of an approach by the writer Wendell Berry, who talks about going back to the place that he was from and becoming a farmer in that space, and coming back with a native and a citizen mentality, but that radical attention where nothing is beneath notice is a kind of anti-violent form of being indigenous. So I just would be really careful about the idea of like, there's no perfect return, there's no perfect, but just recognizing memory that is embodied in the place, and embodied, and also coping with the traumas of the places that one enters and the ways that those things are played out in our own bodies, which I think can be a harder thing. So these affective spaces can be harder to theorize, but important part of the conversation as well. And then just one last thing I will say, because I'm coming from a study of the Christian imagination, and I initially was very motivated by a contemporary theologian, African-American theologian in the US, a systematic theologian called Willie Jennings, who points to the legacy of the inverted hospitality of Christian missionary work during the colonial period. And so the idea of going to a place to offer something as opposed to being received, that reorientation is part of a process of becoming indigenous, which is that there's a two-way flow. So there's a sort of pedagogic practice as well that's about acknowledging that you don't go to a place only to offer something. So anyway, that is imperfect and worthwhile endeavor.
And actually, Maria had an addition to her question, which I just now saw, which was to say that she was thinking in terms of climate change as a social issue that is global. And I may add to that my own comment, let's say. Maybe we should also think in terms of becoming indigenous of a particular land, but also of the whole land of the planet. So how is this playing out from your perspective?
I live in a working class neighborhood that is traditionally a working class neighborhood near the Guinness factory, which is one of the biggest employers in Dublin. There are several community gardens that I've become peripherally involved with. I now have keys to 2 of them. And I will also say that if I am in Dublin by September, it will be the first time that I've lived anywhere for longer than 3 years, since I was 18. So this is actually a very practical and intentional reality for me right now, to decide to be part of the place where I'm in. And that means, of course, this community, but it also means in just as a deeper relation to things that have come through the people that live here as well, and recognizing that I may never be fully integrated. In a way, this is an orientation towards the land and towards the planet, that we can't, I don't feel so optimistic to say that I just internally, personally can reverse Cartesian history in my own body, but that the effort itself is worthwhile, and becoming, you know, as a practice, as a kind of like reparation practice to the land and to my own body and my own embodied reality.
Thank you. And now,
sorry, I lost my connection.
It's good to have you back. I'm just now editing your name, and actually you're right on time, because we have a question for you from our YouTube commenter and presenter from yesterday, Ioana, who was wondering if you could say something about the impact of the International Monsanto Tribunal for corporate accountability and for the human rights struggle regarding corporate violations. And I'm not sure if maybe you want to answer them together, because there's also another question from Maria, who was wondering if you could explain how transnational justice works in terms of who has the power to enforce and define it. And sorry, and I mixed up the comments, and she was saying mostly in terms of climate change as a social justice issue that is global. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. So first of all, Monsanto International Tribunal. This is a public tribunal. The public tribunals are, well, tribunals that are organized by the civil society. The first one, and to say the most successful one, was the Russell Tribunal concerning Vietnam, which was led by Sartre. And since then, people, well, take this model. What is different with the Monsanto Tribunal is that although it's, so this tribunal doesn't have like, let's say, it's not legally binding, and it doesn't have any kind of binding or enforcement value. So from this point of view, it's something that can create awareness. And what it's also interesting with this tribunal is that it's the decision were taken by 5 judges from Hague, but there is nothing binding there. So from this is good as a, let's say, a rhetoric. It's good as a naming and shaming. But I believe that something stronger is needed in order to enforce corporate accountability. And the second question, in terms of what is transnational justice and who enforces it. So you have the level of international justice, and this is given by the international organization or regional organizations. And then transnational justice, it's actually something that remains at the national level. It is enforced by national judges, but concerns crimes which are transnational crimes, and where, for example, perpetrators or victims are not necessarily citizens of that state, but the power to enforce transnational justice is upon national judges from various jurisdictions that allow this kind of system. So I'm not sure if I was clear, but I believe that transnational justice, what we call not international justice, transnational justice is something that it's still well, in the hands of national judges. Okay, so this was these were my questions, my answers. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Raluca. We might get more questions and comments for YouTube, but in the meantime, I would like to go back to Manuela, yes, and see what she has to say.
Thank you so much to all of you. That was a very rich panel, and it's like a lot of things to work through and think through. I have a comment or question for each of you also. So starting with Ioana, I am very much in favor of criticizing the phenomenon that the notion of epistemic extractivism addresses. At the same time, the concept of epistemic extractivism itself, I think, is very problematic. And of course, it's difficult to know when you say, you know, there's, you don't have the experience. I don't think it is about scholarly experience. I just want to caution about the track record of some of the people involved on both sides of these debates. And I think it is problematic to accuse colleagues of epistemic extractivism that you have worked with for 20 years. So, of course, you can have your own opinion, and maybe that is your opinion that you're sharing with us. But in case you stumbled upon this recently, I think you should beware not to be drawn into what I think is an internal feud. You know, it's like a family feud. Because if you have a political, I mean, if somebody like Ramon Grosescu has a political problem now with some of his colleagues, it didn't just occur to him now, right? So you can't work and cite and write and publish and do events with people for 20 years and all of a sudden realize, oh, they're not taking their indigenous communities into account. We were talking about this yesterday, right? The way in which decoloniality in some circles has become a fashion. And I think the same goes for kind of criticizing the main figures. So you can build a career, not that that's what Ramon Grosescu is doing, but acquiring prominence by criticizing the prominent figures is also a kind of personality building, right? So I have no problem saying this online. I've said that to Ramon himself, and that's why I am not willing to engage in promoting the concept of epistemic extractivism. That is one maybe very personalized story around it. The less personalized story is we know where the concept of epistemic extractivism comes from. It has to do with economic extractivism. I think getting attention away from the economic extractivism by hijacking the concept and making it about you, basically, not you yourself, but the ones who are using it, is not very decolonial. Let's criticize the phenomenon. Let's criticize not engaging with indigenous communities, not acknowledging, not letting people speak. But just coining a concept and claiming you're the one discovering it, I don't think is the way to go. So I hope you take this constructively and not in any other way. Oana, thank you so much. That was moving and inspiring in so many ways. And when I was listening to you, I was thinking about the first time I read about how Ireland can be made an object of post-colonial studies, but hasn't been central in it. And this was in a edited volume by Neil Lazarus, who was first kind of making the point, not first, I'm sure not the first one, but the prominent one making the point that, wait, it was not just transatlantic and they take Ireland into account. And I know that some other people have looked at colonialism in Ireland more clearly because of their shifting positionalities. And one of them is Festus Ikiontoye, who is basically, as a Nigerian living in Ireland, has experienced both the racism towards himself and his family, and was able to see through the colonial structures still very much pervading Ireland, and so or permeating. And he has a wonderful article in a dossier on uneasy post-colonialisms, which really makes this point. So I think it's very inspiring the way you talked about the shifting positionality, because on the one hand, there is a privilege in being able to choose who you want to be in a particular audience. And in some cases, you don't have the choice because you are read through the colonial genealogies that that place carries. And you will be read as the American if that is the current kind of enemy image, so to say. And for instance, not to engage only in negative comments, the idea of racial genealogies and being read through them is one of the most important contributions that I think Ramon Grosvogel has made, right? So it's not like I'm discarding the research, just some political positions. So my question concretely would be, do you see any differences and similarities or any way of relating Ireland and Romania as uneasy post-colonial spaces? Or yeah, oh yeah. So okay, we are on the same wavelength here. For Raluca, I always learn so much from you. This is something that the perspective that we share, I think, is there, and then the fields in which we work are so different that all the time I say, oh my God, oh wow, okay, I need to look into that. So very concretely, the question of the 15 universities who have banned the use of the sale of Coca-Cola on their campuses, is any prominent university among them, or any Ivy Leagues? Because I think the action itself is important, but 15 universities in the US is really not much unless they are some of the ones that matter. Because right now, this morning on the news, there was this whole process against Coca-Cola by a city in northern Germany, in Lüneburg. Although Germany does not have a water problem yet, but Coca-Cola has found wonderful water in Lüneburg that it's pumping out since forever, and now they want to drill another hole, and that apparently would really deplete the city's resources. So because it's in Germany, it gets more attention, and it's like, well, how dare they? But we know this has been going on for a long time. So I wonder whether this precedent can be used. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. I'll talk for too long anyway. Thank you.
I wanted to thank you for the comment. It's true that I didn't know the politics behind the concept, the idea, but I stumbled upon this idea while doing research on extractivism in general. And I looked at extractivism and I saw how disruptive can be. And that's how I reached to the concept. And I found it important in the discussion, not only in the discussion about extractivism, but also on the discussion on how knowledge is being extracted and how precisely the fights against extractivism are depoliticized many times through extraction of knowledge. And that's how I reached. Obviously, at some point while reading Grosvogel's critique, I had this thought that, okay, he's talking about epistemic extractivism, and he is not bringing necessarily a contribution, but he is bringing the contribution of Silvia Rivera Cusicancui, who was for a long time a critique of many ways of colonizing knowledge from a very localized position. But in the same time, I felt somehow pressure to, I don't know, because he used the concept and there is this academic pressure, you know, to indicate the sources. Somehow I felt this pressure to say, okay, this is the context where it formally appeared. And this is a longer discussion on how knowledge is produced, legitimized, and who cites who. And I I felt somehow obliged to cite him because he used it formally, but I didn't know. I didn't know the politics behind it, and it's obviously relevant because in the same time, what he accuses other people is precisely what he is doing with that, and and obviously I should have looked for it. And that's I don't know. I think that's the thing that I wanted to say. And thank you for the dialogue, for the discussion.
Can I briefly clarify, please? Yeah, Tasia? Okay. I'm not saying don't quote him. You can say exactly what you just said. You can use the term and say, I find it helpful, but here's the context, or here's my ambivalence with it. That's fine.
Thank you, Manuela. Raluca, you were going to say something?
It's just one short comment and also a question, but you can ask. So concerning what Manuela said, but of course it's difficult to do this. But I think that, for example, a Bourdieusian approach to the way competition between various epistemologies are born, I think it's very interesting. But then, of course, you have to go to those people, interview them, understand the entire context. I'm not sure if this is manageable. And also, after we answered this round, I would be very much interested to, if you could develop a little bit what you want to do with this in your PhD. So what's the point of this PhD? I assume that this was the sort of, I don't know, theoretical part or something at the beginning, or not sure. Maybe it's not. Maybe this is it. But I would want to hear more about how you want to develop your PhD and what you want to do with these notions and currents of thinking. Okay, thank you.
Can I also just jump in very shortly to because there's something that hasn't been addressed, and namely that epistemic. If let's forget about let's talk about the phenomenon that this concept addresses, and and I think that the bigger context is that of Western appropriations of non-Western knowledges, right? And even if some, again, coming back to the discussion of decoloniality becoming a fashion, even if the word itself and the concepts have started be using the institutions of knowledge like the university, the museum, and so on, and the social reality, shows that this is actually the bigger issue of extractivism and not some internal thing that happened within decolonial thought, right?
Thank you. Ioana, you would like to answer that?
First, about Raluca's comment. I think how I got to discuss this in what context. So my PhD research addresses the foreign relations of the European Union. And in its foreign relations and in the trade agreements that the European Union proposes, usually it has a normative, there are normative requirements, basically. And my paper is precisely a critique to this idea of normative power Europe from a post-colonial, decolonial perspective. So that's how I started. And epistemic extractivism, I discovered, very nice choice of language. So I discovered this idea of epistemic extractivism precisely doing that, looking at how the European Union imposes norms and how it assumes this kind of universalism about norms, and in the same time how what the trade agreements do is to make extractivism in Latin America more of a problem than it actually and then it already that already is. So that's how I reached to the concept, and I wanted to develop it in the larger PhD, and precisely to show how resource extractivism and epistemic extractivism are entwined in a way that in order for the European Union to promote universal norms, it has to extract knowledge. It has to extract. It has to, for example, put in trade agreements, I don't know, titles about indigenous peoples without indigenous peoples, and that was how I got to the concept.
Thank you, Ioana. Oana, would you like to address Manuela's question?
Yes. Yes, because it's one of the reasons I wanted to participate in the conference. So I'm very grateful for the offering of Festus Ikeon Toy's text, which I will make use of. And also wanted to add the more popular books of Emma Dabiri, who is an Irish Nigerian journalist living in Dublin, so a lot of complications there as well, but is one of the first popular books that really speaks to the experience of a Black woman living in Ireland, growing up in Ireland, and it's called Don't Touch My Hair. And also Akala's Natives, which is Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, which has a significant portion that addresses the Irish question. So I think my answer is most appropriately addressed from affective experience, and this is also to affirm the value of other forms of knowledge. So just early investigations into my earliest experiences of race and of being raced, and that were formative for me, and how I came at late last to understand myself as white-bodied after living in the US for many years. And I had the sense for a long time in the US that I had not had a racial formation in Romania, which of course wasn't true. And I'm very interested in the Roma perspectives and learning more just from that form of indigeneity. I think the important readings that have come for me recently have been from Christina Sharp and from Saidiya Hartman. So Christina Sharp's Legacies of Being in the Wake. So the book is called In the Wake on Blackness and Being, and Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother. And the questions of these kind of impossible archives, and what do you do when the archive ends? So for people in the US living in the legacy of transatlantic slavery, the archive ends at a particular point. And so how do you form a post-colonial identity when you can't properly mine your own archive? So the question in Ireland about post-coloniality, looking at 800 years of British occupation, and then thinking about Romania, like what's happened in the last 800 years in Romania, and is that considered as a form of, are those moments in history considered as occupation that now can be seen and theorized through through a post-colonial lens? So these are questions that I have. I wasn't raised in Romania, and I'm I'm still interested in having these conversations in order to acclimatize myself to current discourse. But I feel it affectively, and I feel, yeah, I feel that there are great connections. And in the same spirit of like an affective response, when I first came to Ireland in 2001, what I didn't understand then is that Ireland is so recently a primarily rural country, in a way that in gesture, in sort of the questions of like proprioception, the perception that comes to the body before being conscious of it, and also interoception, so awareness of what is happening in my body. So I didn't have these tools at the time, but I felt an immediate kinship with just socially and with the land in Ireland in a way that I hadn't felt since my childhood in Romania. So these have been questions that I've had since I first came here in 2001, and I'm really excited. I'm grateful for the question and excited to explore them further.
Okay, thank you for the question, Manuela. So I will start by saying that I haven't analyzed in depth this boycott. But I know, for example, I can give you two names. So I just searched now. Actually, I just found two names which I think they are important, which is the University of Illinois and Columbia University. Okay, and Columbia University, actually, there are only some colleges. It's not the entire university. There are only some departments and some institutes. When I was in Bogota, nobody knew about this boycott. This is something that I can tell you, is that in Bogota, even human rights organization didn't know about the boycott. So I'm not sure to what extent it's really successful. And this is something that I want to study. There are three boycotts that I want to continue this one with three boycotts. One that was successful, and it was against Polaroid in South Africa. This one, this was in the 80s. This one on Coca-Cola in Guatemala and for crimes in Guatemala and Colombia. And the third one is for Shell for complicity in crimes in Nigeria and Myanmar. And as far as I know, for example, the boycott on Shell, Shell didn't even respond. While in this case, Coca-Cola launched a counter-communication campaign, which it means that at least, it gets involved. So I'm interested to see this, but for the moment, I don't think that they are like really successful.
Thank you all for your questions, comments, and contributions overall. I think we can maybe end the discussion here, as it was very fruitful, and I think we're all going to take a lot of both information and new challenges to our own thinking with us, not least because I also am going to present in the afternoon and I want to get ready. And I think that for me, at least, the afterthought that I will take with me after this great encounter and after all your talks is that we need to keep building these alliances in a very conscientious way, alliances which, of course, have as a goal our, as I was saying before, common struggle, or as Julie Klinger had said it last year in Telciu, our common struggle for survival, which I think necessarily passes through this decolonial fight, as well as many others allied perspectives. So thank you all for being here in this alliance, and let's see if we can maybe take it further in our research, but also personal lives, and maybe meet in the next years in Telciu or in other locations. Thank you all again. We'll see you at 3 p.m. Telciu time, as Manela coined it. All the best.